despite the strong influence of colonization, political dominance and oppression are not solely due to colonialism. So it's really, indigeneity is a really interesting problem in Southeast Asia rather than a self-evident condition. Um, so that's the challenge when it comes to studying indigeneity. Um, how is it characterized on the ground here in North America, and how has it been approached in Southeast Asia? Uh, so I think that how it's been approached in Southeast Asia has changed over the decades. And it's only now that we're really, that Southeast Asia scholars are really beginning to grapple with the question of indigeneity rather than the question of indigenous peoples. And to me, those are very, very different things, because it's easy enough to, especially if you're, very country focused in your research, to just sort of say, okay, well, these people have been designated as indigenous minorities. Or in the Philippines, that's very, very easy because we actually use the English term indigenous peoples. So there's no ambiguity there. You're saying, okay, these people are indigenous peoples, these people are not. But in other parts of Southeast Asia, there are these different populations that are basically the local version of what we would call indigenous peoples in other places. Um, what am I trying to say here? But okay, but now we're grappling with questions of indigeneity, especially as conversations across the Pacific have increased between the indigenous peoples populations in Southeast Asia uh, and indigenous populations in the West. Okay. So that, I think, is probably the biggest uh, development that has occurred in terms of indigeneity studies or indigenous studies within Southeast Asia, is that this conversation is now happening, and it's happening whether scholars like it or not. And from my vantage point, at least, I can see that uh, in part because this conversation is happening, then scholars like myself who are not from indigenous categorized groups um, have to pay attention to the different ways in which indigeneity is operationalized and conceptualized by these particular populations in the region, and therefore uh, also we also have to grapple with how those concepts um, and the ways that indigeneity is operationalized by these groups is so radically different from the sort of international UN idea of in indigeneity, and that you have very, very different ideas about this seemingly simple term indigenous than you do in the West. And so for someone like me who's very much Western orientated in terms of my academic and intellectual formation, you know, it poses a really, really interesting problem that I think is worth sort of investigating. Um, Now, of course, the problem is that a lot of the scholarship right now on indigeneity in Southeast Asia really consists of scholars like me grappling with this sort of uh, grappling with this sort of mismatch, between how we think about indigeneity in the West and how the local populations that we study think about indigeneity. And so that's where I'm at right now, and that's where a lot of people are at. But I know that the local populations themselves don't concern themselves with those kinds of contradictions, you know, because they're immersed in it, and this is about I mean, from their perspective, they're just doing what they can to deal with their particular disadvantaged position in their respective societies. Um, yeah, I think maybe this is something that we can talk about more later if there are particular questions, because there's many directions in which I can go with regard to this question.
I'd just like to read 2 sentences from your 2019 article, Preserving Tradition. To government agencies, indigeneity is quantified through the documentation of cultural ephemera. To mainstream Filipinos, indigeneity is legible only through the public display of material culture whose authenticity is then gauged according to how exotic or obviously different it is from their own. And then you go on, and what I want to highlight there is that indigeneity is a lowercase I, right? And these 2 sentences follow in the wake of you talking about indigenous peoples, capital I, capital P. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit, and then we'll move on to our final question and open up space for Q&A a little about that. It's not a slippage, it's sort of a deliberate choice. And I wonder if you could just sort of situate that a little bit for us.
Well, okay. The origin of that lowercase I and uppercase I thing had to do with when I first gave a presentation about it, and I could put it on a PowerPoint, and it was kind of cute, you know. But really, the thing is that I was attempting a shortcut way to talk about indigenous peoples in a region where potentially everyone is indigenous. You know, but when I do teach about it, when I'm doing actual courses about it, I've learned that it's easier if I say the word native versus indigenous. I think for the students, at least, it's easier because I can't keep saying when I'm just sort of talking, you know, capital I indigenous and lowercase I indigenous. Okay, so but yeah, that's really the only binary here that I'm trying to kind of convey, that there is this binary, but at the same time, you know, it doesn't make the majority populations less native than the indigenous capital I uh, populations that we're talking about. So yeah, so that's part of the problem, right? Is that it's not about who's necessarily first on the land. You know, in many cases, everyone's been on the land equal, you know, for an equal number, for equal length of time. And so that's really where it comes from. But there is a lot of potential slippage, because who dictates in each ASEAN country, who dictates who gets classified as indigenous versus not? It's the states, and the states are controlled by the majority populations. And so sometimes there's a lot of slippage there, like in a place like Malaysia, for example, where they have this category Bumiputra, where it's not about who's minoritized and marginalized, but more a statement about who really should have. It's really more about a social hierarchy with the natives at the top, or who should be on top. So you have the Malays, who are the majority population in power and have been very, you know, attempting to be as hegemonic as possible with regard to religious and cultural practices and identity making practices. And legal practices related to all of those things. they refer to themselves as indigenous peoples and think that the UN drip applies to them. Of course, that's an interesting problem for us academics to talk about, right? But the thing is that when somebody in Malaysia talks about indigenous peoples, it can mean many different things, whereas scholars and people outside of Malaysia talking about indigenous peoples are really referring to these particular populations that are othered and marginalized. And so yeah, there's a lot of slippage in a place like that, and other countries in Southeast Asia don't even want to acknowledge that category of indigenous peoples. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. It just means that they're just not recognized by the state, especially in a place like, say, Laos, where everybody technically is indigenous, and they don't use that term. Yeah, so there's a lot of it's a very slippery term, and it's difficult to pin it down as a collective noun or category of rights and identity in Southeast Asia, because you've got not just very different sort of legal categories or legal classifications across different ASEAN countries, but yeah, there's our histories in Southeast Asia are really can be really quite complex in terms of not just the movement of people, but also the movement of identities across maybe the same population over time. And so it gets very, 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 very messy. Yeah. So in terms of how uh, it's being approached in Southeast Asia right now. Right now, the conversation we're having about indigeneity in Southeast Asia has to do with sort of grappling with the slipperiness of this term. Whereas the conversations about indigeneity elsewhere, especially in the Americas, North America, um, uh, you know, those are very, very different conversations, and they're dominated now, or becoming more dominated now, thankfully, by indigenous scholars themselves, or scholars who are, PhDs and professors who come from these different indigenous communities. That's not quite where we're at in Southeast Asia yet, although there are a few professors from these different indigenous minority communities. That's still not the dominant. I mean, that's like a small minority. I think like a handful of people in Borneo is what I can think of. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suspect there'll be plenty of questions um, about this, if not from the um, audience, then from me. So,
Okay.
um, especially in the Malaysian case, I mean, it's one we're told to sort of transcend
Yep.
methodological nationalism, but this is
Yep.
precisely a case where you need to sort of situate these discourses within the nation state itself, in a place like Malaysia, for instance.
Yep. Context still matters a whole
Still,
lot.
still
Yeah.
matters a whole
A
lot.
whole lot. Yep.
Okay, so the final question before we head into just a general Q&A is, um, building off of all of this, how do you imagine the future of Southeast Asian studies? um, what would you see as a productive turn for the field? And in other words, what should Southeast Asian studies be or become? And should is really the operative word there for this question.
Uh,
Um,
should.
yeah,
Shoulda, coulda.
shoulda, coulda.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's another impossible question to answer, just like the second question they asked me about trajectories and stuff. Um, I will say that I think that there's been a continuity as far as Southeast Asian studies between uh, earlier trends from before I was an undergrad, trends towards indigenizing Southeast Asian studies. A push from from regional scholars, Southeast Asian scholars of Southeast Asia, to indigenize, the academic study of Southeast Asia. And I think it's kind of been a continuous um, line to um, a kind of a movement now to decolonize Southeast Asian studies, and that's not the move towards decolonization is not peculiar to Southeast Asia.